Thank you, Ambassador. That is a fantastic message that we want to hope is heard throughout the day. Why we're gathered here today is so that we can start having these conversations, so we can start working together. I want to invite Ana Gonzalez-Barrera, thank you, to come up, as well as Randy Capps. Oh, right there. Good morning. We're not even in the afternoon yet. Come on up. All right, how do we know what to do when we want to address health disparities and create health equity? How do we know which stories to tell? How do we know what the story is to tell? How do we know which directions to take? Well, we're very fortunate today to have Ana Gonzalez-Barrera and Randy Capps to help us, to show us how to tell that story by working with data, by working with communication materials, by working with their publications. It is a great honor to introduce first Ana Gonzalez-Barrera. She is a senior researcher with the Pew Research Center. She has the expertise in public opinion research. You must be very busy these days. And statistical analysis of the Hispanic and immigrant populations in the U.S. She is a primary contributor to all the different stages of the Center's National Survey of Latinos. She has worked for over 4 years at Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas in Mexico, where she has coordinated 2 rounds of the Mexico and the Americas Public Opinion Survey in both 2004 and 2010. Then you served as, I'm going to tell you your story. Then you served as the director of the population distribution for the Mexican Population Council before joining Pew Research in 2011. Thank you for being with us today and helping us to tell the story.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of background information about immigrants in the U.S., how they have been changing the demographics of the U.S., of the country, what the main characteristics of Latinos are, also what are the recent trends that we're seeing in terms of recent immigration into the U.S., a little bit about how this impacts politics, so the election, and also the geographic dispersion of Hispanics throughout the country, so that you can take a look a little bit of how different communities are settled in different parts of the region of the country. So first of all, last year we reached a record number of immigrants living in the U.S., 45 million immigrants who are living in the U.S. This is actually projected to rise by about 30 more million the next 50 years. However, as a share of the U.S. population, immigrants today make up about the same share as they did in earlier waves of immigration to the country. So earlier waves, I'm talking about early 20th century and late 19th century. The difference with this new wave after 1965 to today is the makeup of the origins of these immigrants. Most immigrants that came after 1965 to the country come from Latin America and Asia, and earlier waves came mostly from Europe. So this had the impact of changing the makeup of the U.S. population greatly. So this is a map that shows the main immigrant group that lived in every state in the U.S. in 1960. This is before 1965, when there was a reform that changed country quotas and allowed big inflows of immigrants from both Latin America and Asia to come to the country. So as you see, 1960, the most or the number one country of immigrants in a lot of states was Germany, followed by maybe Mexico, Italy, Canada. Mexican immigrants were mostly just in the border with Mexico. Canadians were in the border with Canada, and the rest were mostly Germany and Italy for the most part. This is how it looks like in 2013. So as you see, immigration from Latin America really changed the demographics, particularly of immigrants in the US. So in 2013, most of the states, the #1 immigration country was Mexico. We also see, for example, the Dominican Republic as #1 in New York, or El Salvador here in DC and Virginia. So historically, the country was divided between black and white, white being the very large majority of the population. But after the law of 65, we saw an increase, particularly in the Hispanic population. And by 2001, Hispanics had become the largest minority in the country. Today, they make up 18% of the US population. And we are projecting that in 50 years, they're going to reach 24%. So in 2065, 1 of every 4 Americans will be of Hispanic origin. But not only that, whites will no longer be the majority of the population in the US. However, there has been some changes recently in immigration. So after 2005, the number of recent immigrants coming peaked and started declining, mostly because of the recession, the economic recession, and also because there was a decline in the number of immigrants coming from Latin America, particularly Mexico. Today, the recent immigrants are more likely to come from Asia than from Latin America. And we are projecting that in the next few decades, Asians are actually going to become the largest immigrant group in the country. One of the things that also happened right after the recession is that the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the country first peaked in 2007, then fell down a little bit, and then stabilized. In the last 5 years, we've basically seen the same number of immigrants without authorization living here in the US. This is our latest estimate, 11.1 for 2014, which is statistically the same as 2009, the 11.3 that you see there. One of the things that have happened also recently is that immigrants who are here without authorization are very likely to have been here for more than a decade. 66% of immigrants who are today here without authorization have been here for at least a decade in the US. And very few have come recently in the last 5 years. Another trend that has happened since the recession is that more Mexicans started going back to Mexico. And between 2009 and 2014, there were actually more Mexicans that went back to Mexico than there were Mexicans coming to the US. And this was a completely different trend. We had never seen this negative flow of Mexicans between Mexico and the US since the 1940s, at least. We have also seen a decline after a very rapid rise in the number of Mexican immigrants living in the United States in the 1970s. We saw a drop. So it first reached a peak in 2007 again, and then it dropped by about 1 million up until 2014. But most of this drop in Mexican immigrants is actually among the unauthorized. When we look at the number of unauthorized Mexican immigrants, it actually has reduced by about 1 million since 2007 when it peaked. They still make up a majority of the immigrants, of unauthorized immigrants in the US, but they are no longer growing the way they were growing. So some of the impacts that we see, so now we have 18% of Americans or people living in the US who are of Hispanic origin. And this, of course, has an impact in politics. Between last presidential election, and this presidential election, the Hispanic electorate grew by 4 million. And most of this growth is actually not because of immigration, but because of young Hispanics becoming of age and voting. About 3.2 million became of age between 2012 and 2016. And only 1.2 million became naturalized citizens, so they could vote. this means that about 800,000 Hispanics are actually turning 18 every year and are becoming eligible to vote. However, Hispanics have a very low turnout rate, so when it comes to casting a ballot, they are less likely to go and do so than blacks or whites, for example. In 2012, only 48% of those who were eligible to vote went out and casted a ballot. This year, we are actually wondering how many are actually going to come out. So there's a record 27 million who are eligible to go and vote. We don't know how many of them are going to turn out and do that. Some of the reasons why Hispanics do not turn out in the numbers as other groups do. One of the reasons is because they're mostly young. So this is the comparison. Here you can see that Latinos and Asians are actually the least likely to vote, and blacks and whites are the most likely to come out and vote. So one of the reasons is because Latinos are more likely to be young. So 44% of Latino eligible voters are millennials. That means that they're between the ages of 18 and 35. Young people are less likely to vote in general. They're also located in certain states that are not battleground states, particularly California and Texas. Those two states hold almost half of the Latino population who are eligible to vote. And those two states are not battleground states, so they actually do not get as much attention from the campaigns as other states. So those are two of the reasons. Another reason could be also that maybe they don't feel involved in the election, or they don't see candidates who reflect their interests. We're not sure. So just showing you a little bit about the dispersion. So as I mentioned, a lot of Latinos live in just a few states. About the ethnic composition. Most Latinos living in the U.S. are actually from Mexican origin. As I showed you, immigrants from Mexico make up the larger majority of, or the main country, source country for immigrants in a lot of the states. So Mexicans make up the main or the largest share of Hispanics in the U.S., followed by Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadoran, Dominican, Guatemalan, and others. However, if you look into the makeup of the Hispanic community in different cities, you see how it changes. So, for example, in Miami, more than half of the population are of Cuban descent. Here in DC, we see that both Salvadoran and Honduran are together make up the majority of the population. In New York, it is Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who have the largest share there. But in LA, in Atlanta, in Chicago, and other cities, it will be Mexico who will have the majority of the Hispanic population. In terms of dispersion, so as I mentioned, they are more likely to live in just a few, or larger numbers of them are likely to live in just a few states. And when we talk about metropolitan areas, actually half of the Latino population live in only the 10 of the metropolitan areas in the country. LA being the number one, followed by New York, Miami, Houston, and then other cities in California, Texas, Arizona, and Chicago. This is a country of how. This is a map that shows how Hispanic population is distributed in each of the counties in the U.S. So almost all of the Hispanics live in just half of the counties in the U.S., but they have been dispersing a lot. If we looked at the same map 25 years ago, we would see that most of these that are light yellow color would actually be white, and the concentration will be very much along the U.S.-Mexico border in Florida, New York, and Illinois. However, the counties where we have seen rapid increases in the last 15 years are not the ones where we see the largest concentrations. Are actually other countries that are more likely to be suburban or are even, some of them are even rural. The counties with the largest growths, for example, are all in North Dakota, the two of them. Some others are in the south, which are not their typical places. Another characteristic of the Hispanic population today is that the majority of Hispanics today are actually U.S. born. They're not foreign born anymore. So when we look at the counties where U.S. born Hispanics make up the majority, we see that most of the counties that have at least 1,000 Hispanics living in them actually also have a majority of them being U.S. born. There are very few, and that's only the darkest color, there are very few who actually have a majority of population who are foreign born. Among them would be Miami and some counties in this region. So with that, I hope I set up the
Very well, thank you. Yes.
for Randy. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't worry, we are leaving room for questions afterward. I know we have a lot of questions to ask you. That was fantastic, thank you. Now we want to turn it over to Dr. Randy Capps. He is the Director of Research at the U.S. programs, for U.S. programs at the Migration Policy Institute. You're a demographer by training, and you've published he has published widely on immigrant integration at the state and local levels, including profiles of immigrant populations in some of the places that you've mentioned: Arkansas, Connecticut, Maryland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Louisville, Kentucky, and Napa County, California. Dr. Capps has examined the impact of detention and deportation of immigrant parents on children. His areas of expertise include immigration trends, unauthorized populations, immigrants in the U.S. labor force, the children of immigrants and their well-being, and immigrant health care and public benefits access and use. All topics that we know are very important to increasing health equity among Latino children and families. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. I want to thank Sharon Zalewski for the invitation to speak here today, and everybody in the audience for coming, and also Anna Gonzalez-Barrera for the excellent introduction. I have a few colleagues here that I need to acknowledge. I want to focus in on two areas. First will be just how does the immigration picture look here in this area, in the metropolitan area, and how is that different from the rest of the country? And then second, I'll shift gears a little bit and focus in on the Central American family and child migrants that we talked about a little bit earlier this morning. So first of all, you can see here the rise in the immigrant population. This is all immigrants to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. There were about 500,000 back in 1990. There are about 1.5 million now as of 2015. So a tripling of that population over the last 25 years. That's faster growth than a lot of the rest of the country. It's not the fastest growing region, but it's one of them. Growth has slowed down here a little bit since 2010, and actually really since 2008, since the recession, but not as much as in other places, right? This is still a very highly prosperous area economically, and that is still drawing a lot of immigration to the area. The percentage of immigrants in the area was about 13% back in 1990. It's about 24% now, and that's almost double the national average of 13%. So Washington, D.C.'s kind of recently joined that club of big cities with very large scale immigrant populations. Where do immigrants live in the region? Well, not surprisingly, they tend to live in the same counties, cluster in the same counties with the largest overall population. So you have 1 million each total population in Fairfax and Montgomery, and about 1/3 of 1 million each of immigrants. And so the immigrants comprise about 1/3 of the total population. And this is not including children of immigrants, right? This is not including the second generation. So I think as the map we saw earlier showed, there tends to be a higher proportion of first generation than second generation in this region than there is nationally. And that's part of the reason why these percentages are so high. But you can see in most jurisdictions in the area, about a quarter or more of the population is foreign-born. The only real exceptions are the outlying counties of Anne Arundel and Frederick. So where do immigrants in this region come from? They're less likely to be Latino. They're less likely to be from Latin America. Only 40% come from Latin American origins compared to about half nationally. The big story here is really that only, you'll see in a minute, 3% come from Mexico as opposed to about a quarter nationally. That's the biggest difference between Washington, D.C. metro and the country. We also have more African immigrants and more Asian immigrants proportionally in this region. The Latin American share of the foreign-born population is highest out in the Manassas area, Prince George's County, Prince William County at half or more. So these counties maybe look a little bit more like the national picture in terms of Latino immigrants being by far the largest group. And then you can see it's fairly flat for most of the rest of the area. Now, Salvadorans are the number one country of origin for all immigrants in this area, and that's unique in the country. If you saw Dr. Gonzalez-Barrera's map earlier, the only two states that were shaded in where El Salvador was the number one Latino origin country were Maryland and Virginia. Most of the rest of the country, it's Mexico. So this is something that makes this area distinct and somewhat distinctly vulnerable to this migration crisis with the Central American families and children who are coming, which I'll get to in a minute. The other top origin countries here are mostly familiar around the rest of the country, although the major Asian countries, several of them are higher up the list than Mexico, which is again a little different. And then you see also Ethiopia on the list. So again, we have a little bit higher share of African immigrants here than nationally. Now I want to just spend a minute looking at the unauthorized population. So the unauthorized population here, we estimate, is about 360,000 people. That's out of the 1.5 million I showed you earlier, so that's about a quarter. That's roughly the same as the share of the unauthorized population of all immigrants nationally, right? Again, heavily concentrated in the major counties, Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince William, Prince George's, Washington, D.C. That's where the majority of unauthorized immigrants live. There are a fairly high percentage of the, but they're also dispersed throughout the region, right? So there are significant unauthorized populations outside of those major counties. Now I want to take a look at where the unauthorized population comes from in the region. And here again, I think it's a different story than you see nationally. Like the total immigrant population, the number one country for the unauthorized population in the region is El Salvador. It's followed by Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras, close to the same number. So really it's predominantly a Central American unauthorized population here. And it's growing, right? Okay, as Dr. Gonzalez-Barrera showed you, the overall unauthorized population in the United States has been stable or slightly declining because fewer people are coming from Mexico, but more people are coming from Central America now. In fact, at the southwest border 2 years ago, starting in 2014, was the first time that the number of Central Americans apprehended by the Border Patrol was greater than the number of Mexicans. And that has repeated itself again this year in fiscal 2016. So as we look forward, a lot of the growth in the unauthorized population is going to come from Central America, although fairly large shares of people overstaying their visas from around the world too, with a lot of Asian countries on this list. Okay, now I want to talk about what's been going on with the flow of families and children that are being apprehended at the border. Again, they are mostly coming from the Central American countries, what we call the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, as we heard earlier. This is where we have very high rates of violence, very poor economic conditions. Washington, D.C. has, if you look at Central American immigrants overall, all statuses, regardless of when they came to the United States, Washington, D.C. metropolitan area has the third highest Central American population after L.A. and New York City. It has the second highest Central El Salvadoran population after L.A. and significant populations from Guatemala and Honduras as well. So this is sort of to put some specific numbers on it as to why people would come to this area. Why do the unaccompanied children come to this area is because they already have family members here and they're predominantly reunified with those family members. So this is to put some more detail on the numbers we heard earlier, right? We're all aware that 2014 was the year that we heard about the Central American migration crisis. This was the year when we started to see record numbers of Central American children and families coming across the border. A total of almost 140,000 that were either classified as what the Border Patrol calls family units. That's at least a parent and a child traveling together, and unaccompanied children traveling alone. That 140,000 was up from just under 40,000 2 years earlier, so a massive increase. Subsided a little bit in 2015, but has bounced back up in 2016. And this is only 10 months worth of data, right? Because that's as far as we could go with this. In reality, it's probably very close to the peak that it was in 2014 by now. The second thing to note on this is I shaded in dark the children and in light the families. And the number of families has been going up more recently. And so we are already above the record number of families that were apprehended at the border in 2014 as of this year. Now, if we look at nationalities, the three nationalities, again, we're talking about Northern Triangle of Central America. This is among the children traveling alone, the unaccompanied children. You could see that it was pretty even up until 2014. That this spike in 2014 included virtually equal numbers of Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Honduran children. Then you see a drop-off in 2015, but that drop-off happened more severely for the Hondurans. We don't know why, and it hasn't come back as much. So there are significantly fewer Honduran children being apprehended alone, traveling alone by the Border Patrol than there were a couple years ago. The Guatemalan numbers never dipped very much. The Salvadoran numbers dipped and then went back up again. Now, we know that conditions in the region didn't change that much, right? And if anything, the violence has become worse in El Salvador. The economic crisis, the drought has become worse in the region. There's no reason to think that these push factors would recede. What we did hear, and again, that was alluded to in Armando Trull's film, is that Mexico began deporting more people from Mexico back to Central America starting in 2015. Those numbers really went up. And so we don't know how many people may still be caught in Mexico, being deported in Mexico, if Mexico can sustain that. It's very controversial. Clearly, it's been in the US government's interest to have Mexico as a partner in this immigration enforcement. Whether that's the right or wrong thing to do, it appears to be part of the administration's policy. But again, it only appeared to have worked for a year or so because our apprehension numbers are right back up again to where they were in 2014. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, this year what's new is that the family apprehensions are actually exceeding the unaccompanied child apprehensions. And this is the first time that that's happened, and the gap has really widened in the last few months that we have data for. Older children are more likely to travel alone. The younger children are more likely to come with a parent. So we think that this might be an expression of the fact that there's more younger children that are trying to leave the region. But we don't know the reasons for this trend. Now, if we focus in on these children again, about 120,000 children were released to parents or other family members over the last 2 years, since 2014. For those of you who don't know how it works, if a child is apprehended by the Border Patrol traveling alone, within a couple of days, they are transferred into the custody of the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. ORR's contractors provide services for them and try to find their relatives. And half of the time, they're able to find a parent, actually. And about another third of the time, they're able to find another relative. So the vast majority of them then get placed with these relatives, at least temporarily. We don't know how good the placements are. There are all sorts of issues around the safety of these placements and lack of follow-up, but nonetheless, most of them get placed with family members. And so out of those 120,000 that were placed with family members across the country, 10%, 13,000 came to this region. And that's fourth about after LA, New York, and Houston in the country. And you can see the biggest number in the region was in Prince George's County, actually, followed closely by Fairfax, and then Montgomery, Prince William, and DC. But you can see significant numbers of unaccompanied children were placed with family members across the region. Okay, now I just want to spend a minute on a somewhat complex topic, because the reality is a lot of what's happening with the unaccompanied child population and the family population is going to be determined by U.S. immigration policies. And U.S. immigration policies right now for this population are in flux. And there's three main concerns I want to give you about how the system is working. The main concern is about the immigration court system, right? What happens with both the families and the children is that once they're apprehended and they're released into the public, then they have the right to go before an immigration judge in order to protest their deportation, in order to claim asylum, in order to claim some other form of relief from deportation. Adults don't really have this right. They go through what's called expedited removal, and they're generally deported within a day or two, even if they're from Central America. But the families and children have this right. The problem is there aren't enough immigration judges, there aren't enough immigration courts, and the backlog is huge. It's like up to almost 500,000 people now waiting for their immigration court cases to be decided. This shows you for the families on the left and the children on the right, 70% still pending, 60% still pending. That's of people who've come in any time between 2014 and now. About 2/3 of them still haven't had an immigration court hearing. And this could be a year, 2 years after they were initially apprehended. So this causes a lot of problems because the smugglers can credibly tell people, you will get to go to the United States, you will get released, and you will get to stay there, right? At least temporarily while you're waiting for the immigration court hearing. The second problem with the system is that people don't have a right to an attorney. Unlike in criminal court in the US, where you have the right to an attorney paid by the state, there's no right to a defense attorney in immigration court. The vast majority of people don't get them. So on the family side, something like 90% of the families are not represented in court. If you look at those who are ordered removed on the left, the vast majority of them are people who are unrepresented. But those who got relief, it's a tiny little number, almost all of them were represented. So the representation makes a huge amount of difference. For the children, it's more like 50-50. A little over half of them are getting representation, and the vast majority of them actually are getting relief. But again, among those who don't have an attorney, most of them are being ordered removed. So this has been a big problem. The third problem is that a lot of the people who aren't represented don't even show up for their court hearing. So if you see those who are represented in both of those sets of bars, they're virtually all going to show up. They have an attorney who helps facilitate their coming to court. But large shares of those who don't have an attorney are ruled deported, what's called in absentia. That means they miss a court hearing. They miss a court hearing, it's automatic that they're ordered removed, and they go on a deportation list. They become a top priority for U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement deportation. And in fact, some of them have been deported, particularly some of the children when they turn 18. So how does this work overall? Again, the three big issues are so many pending cases. The backlog is now almost 75,000 unaccompanied children and almost 85,000 family cases, so more than a year's worth, even at the peaks that we're at now of these apprehensions. Because they're ordered in absentia, a lot of people aren't even aware they've been ordered removed. They're completely lost from the process. They have basically become part of the general unauthorized population. It makes them very vulnerable, even more vulnerable than the general unauthorized population. At least the general unauthorized population has reason to believe that nobody knows where they are, that they're not on some kind of a list, but these folks could be on a high priority deportation list. They just don't know it. So that can add, I would think, to the anxiety and mental health and trauma that these families experience and children experience. They do get removed when they turn 18, though. The children have been removed when they turn 18. And this has happened, if you'll remember, back in January and February, the Department of Homeland Security actually made a big deal out of this. They actually had a press announcement that several hundred of these unaccompanied children that had been ordered removed by an immigration judge were actually deported at that time. I think they did it to send a message because they wanted the flow of unaccompanied children to go down. But it also engendered a lot of concern, of course, and fear in immigrant communities. And that's probably going on at a lower level still. We just haven't seen a lot of publicity around it. Then finally, I mentioned some people actually do get relief in immigration court. I don't want to paint a totally bleak picture about it, but it's usually what they call informal relief. And what this means is that at the same time that they're going through the immigration court process, as if that isn't complex enough, they're also applying to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for a status. they're applying for asylum. The children can also apply for what's called special immigrant juvenile status, SIJ status, if they turn 18 and they can't be reunified with both of their parents, which is the case for a lot of these children, then they qualify for that status. But that also, I mean, there are backlogs there too. That also takes a year or two. So the bottom line is you have a lot of people in the community who are in a real immigration limbo. Either they're pending, they've been ordered deported and they don't know it, or they've got informal relief but they're still waiting on a status. So I have a couple discussion questions here, but I will leave them up and we can take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I know I've heard a lot of people talking. I know there's questions.
Yes, I have a question for Anna. Could you expand a little bit on the age distribution of the population?
Sure. So the majority of the Latino population is actually very young. Half of them are under 19 years old. That's for the U.S.-born population. The median age is 29, actually. So half of the population is going to be 29 or younger, and the other half is going to be 29 or older. For those who come here as immigrants, the median age is older because they usually immigrate at an older age. But for those who are born here in the U.S., the median age is 19. So half of that population is going to be underage, or almost half.
Attorney? Yeah, sorry, you mentioned that people do not, the people that are apprehended do not have the right to an attorney. So what happens? What do they do? I mean...
Well, a lot of the time, they will get a letter that tells them that they're supposed to show up in such and such immigration court at such and such date, and they may have moved to a different city, or they may have been assigned an immigration court that's not where they live. They may not get the notice. So a lot of the time, that's why so many unrepresented people are what's called in absentia. They're no-shows at their immigration court hearings. They don't even know that they're supposed to come. Or they may get the letter and they may ignore it. They may feel that they don't have to go to court. The problem is that if they don't go to court, it's almost automatic that they're going to be ordered deported.
Thank you. Is there data on how long the individuals have been here at the time of deportation? Because we hear, of course, about young people who are brought here. It's the only country they've ever known. Is there what does the distribution look like on? Have they been here only recently arrivals, or been here for a many number of years? And similar question for adult deportations. Is there data on length of time that they have been building a life here before they're deported?
There probably are data on that. I'm sure U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement, ICE, keeps those data. You know, we've done some sort of general looks at the data, and the priorities for enforcement right now are a security threat or a major criminal conviction, which would be a felony or multiple misdemeanors, or like they consider a DUI to be a sufficient thing to deport. So that's one group, the folks that they call criminal aliens of criminal conviction. The other main priority is that they would have entered the United States unlawfully since January 2014 or been ordered removed since January 2014. So there's two different populations. The post-2014 are all recent because they're post-2014. By definition, they're very recent. And that's by design because that's the Department of Homeland Security. It's an enhancement of border enforcement. It's the idea that people will know they'll get deported if they come and try to enter the country illegally. And that applies, by the way, to virtually this entire group of families and children that have come in, because most of them have come in since 2014. On the other hand, though, if you look at the characteristics of those with the criminal convictions, they often have been here for a very long time. And there are a lot of stories, anecdotally, if you read the press clips, of someone who had a drug conviction in 1995 or a DUI in 2000 who've been deported, right? And the reality is that they could have had that conviction at any point in time prior. Once they're pulled into the criminal justice system and they're fingerprinted, that old conviction, along with their immigration violation, will pop up. And if the conviction, no matter when it happened, rises to priority level, then they'll be on a priority for enforcement. So if you look at the data, those with criminal convictions, a large share of them are parents with US-born children, a large share of them have been in the country for a long time. And so it's really two different populations.
Question over here.
Are there any intangibles or specifics of why Prince George's County draws a high number of immigrants?
Well, Montgomery County and Prince George's County and Fairfax are the three largest jurisdictions in terms of the overall immigrant population, but the Latino immigrants are a higher share in Prince George's County, and I believe Salvadorans are a higher share. It's also a less expensive county, so in terms of housing costs, that's where your more recent undocumented families are more likely to go, because they're less likely to be able to afford the more expensive areas. However, I think the eastern part of Montgomery County is probably very similar. And some of northern Montgomery County now, there's less expensive housing. The housing tends to be a little bit more expensive, I think, in suburban Virginia. So I think a lot of it will have to do with where are the low-income neighborhoods in the region, the places where undocumented families can afford to live.
I just have a quick question for Anna. The 18% of the population that is Hispanic, does that include both documented and undocumented? I missed that part.
Yeah, it includes that. Although that 18%, majority of them, or 2/3, are actually U.S. born, so they're not even immigrants. Of the third that are immigrants, it does include about 40% who are unauthorized.
I was curious about the data, just like in terms of community-based organizations that maybe started out in the 80s or the 90s during the conflicts in Central America and maybe were based in DC, and how the immigration, where people are immigrating, might have shifted in the last like 25 years. And like in terms of like Maryland, where services might not have been built there 20 years ago, how that's, especially for legal services, how the ways and places people are immigrating are shifting how they can access those services and where they've traditionally been.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't want to say anything about the relative strengths and weaknesses of legal service providers in the region because I don't know about that. As far as the populations are concerned, yes, it was much more heavily concentrated. Latino population was more heavily concentrated. DC, inner ring suburbs in Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George's, and Alexandria and Arlington. It was more heavily concentrated than it is now. At the same time, though, the numbers in all those areas, except Washington, D.C., have been growing. I mean, Washington, D.C., as you're aware, has changed dramatically in terms of housing costs in the last 20 years. And that's pushed a lot of immigrants of all different backgrounds out. That's happened in most, but not all, of the inner ring suburbs. As mentioned earlier, housing costs tend to still be low in Prince George's, parts of Montgomery County. But that's why you're starting to see rapid growth out in Frederick, Anne Arundel, Prince William, and even further out than that now. And I think that's the way a lot of cities in the U.S. are going. The direction's reversed itself from the pattern of wealthier suburbs and lower income inner cities. And D.C. is a prime example of that, with a lot of the lower income communities and immigrant communities being pushed farther and farther out. And that obviously complicates the delivery of legal services and social services, other services, not just because the organizations may be more likely to locate in where immigrants were previously, but also because the population is just more dispersed. So there's just more distance between them than in the past.
move to a break, but if you'll be available to answer any additional questions during the break, please join me in thanking our guest speakers.
Yeah. Mark, you have,
Yeah, real quick.
yes, please, go ahead. You have to make it quick.
No, I just wanted to partially answer your question because we've been working in Miami Park since for about 11 years now. And when we first worked there were very few services, and the Latino community was moving into that area, but gentrification really pushed them out. And now, Prince George's County, had a huge number of immigrants from a number of places, and the schools had. I remember at one point there were like 30,000. I don't know if these data are correct, but I remember a presentation. The schools had 30,000 immigrants, and the staff in the international student department was 6. But anyway, the community is grown. Casa de Maryland's there, we're there, there's a Transforming Neighborhoods initiative, all kinds of things have sort of moved out that.
Thank you, Mark. So again, thank you so much for Doctors Gonzalez-Barrera and Capps. We really appreciate it. It was fantastic.